Hello, my name is Sharon. I'm 68, and I gave my daughter everything I had time love, even my savings. But last month, she sent me an email that simply said, "Please don't come to my wedding. You can watch through Livestream." No greeting, no explanation, just erased. So I didn't argue. I didn't cry, but I did something no one saw coming. Let me ask you, what would you do if your own child shut the door on you like that? Stay with me. This isn't a story about revenge. It's about memory silence and a woman who refused to disappear. Please don't come to the wedding, Mum. You can watch it on Livestream instead. There was no greeting, no dear Mum, no closing either. Just that single line suspended on the glowing screen of Sharon's old laptop. The kind of message that didn't need punctuation, its coldness was complete without it. Sharon stared at it for a long time, her hands resting on the kitchen counter, still damp from rinsing the kettle. She didn't blink, didn't move. Her eyes a soft grey that had seen decades of night shifts, births, deaths, and everything in between didn't well up with tears. They only narrowed slightly as if trying to see past the screen and into her daughter's mind. Then slowly, deliberately, she closed the laptop. She moved through the kitchen like a woman underwater, slow, weightless, careful. She opened the cabinet with its slightly creaky hinge and took down her favourite teacup, the one with the faded blue flowers and a barely there chip on the rim. Natalie had once broken its twin. That had been years ago, 1997, maybe. Sharon remembered, laughing, sweeping up the pieces, saying, "Well, now they're sisters in spirit." She filled the kettle and set it to boil. Steam began to rise. Outside, the cherry trees along the fence line were blooming madly, clusters of soft pink blossoms, bursting open like little fireworks. They caught the morning light and cast shadows on the lace curtains. It was spring, unmistakably. The air smelled faintly of earth and grass, like a season waking up. Sharon carried her tea to the window seat, her place. The cushion was flattened from years of use. The wooden frame creaked gently beneath her weight. From here she could see the front walkway, the mailbox, the old patch of thyme still growing wild beneath the porch steps. Natalie had helped her plant that. Sharon had told her herbs were strong and stubborn. Natalie had asked, like you. She sipped her tea. The cup was warm between her palms, but her fingers didn't feel it. A car door slammed outside. Sharon didn't turn her head, but her ears picked it up. Doris from next door, off to the market. Doris had stopped knocking months ago when Sharon never came out for coffee anymore. People drifted, she supposed. That was the way of it. She looked out at the street, watched the mail truck roll past. Her eyes weren't on the vehicle, though. They were on a shadow that had settled inside her, a question soft but persistent. What did I do wrong? It didn't come with bitterness, only confusion, only silence. The kind of silence that forms when something cracks and no one hears it. The kettle clicked off in the background. She didn't move to reheat it. After a while, Sharon stood. She walked to the front of the house and slowly reached for the window latch. She pushed it shut with both hands, the glass trembling slightly in its frame. Then she turned to the door and twisted the lock. Not hard, not in anger, just firmly. The house responded with a creak in the floorboard behind her, as if it too was settling in. She returned to the kitchen, her steps no longer slow, but deliberate. She opened the drawer by the refrigerator, one she hadn't touched in a long while. Underneath some expired coupons and a rubber-banded bundle of pens, she found what she was looking for. A white envelope, yellowed slightly at the edges, the flap unsealed. On the front, Natalie in Sharon's looping cursive. She turned it over. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. The date in the corner, 2009. She held it in her hand for a long moment. Then she walked back to the window seat, sat down again, and set the letter gently on her lap like something fragile, something that might finally be ready to speak. Sharon opened the old drawer and pulled out a letter addressed to Natalie, written in 2009. Sharon cancelled the automatic tuition payment for Natalie's yoga class for the first time in 7 years. It was a small thing, a quiet line of code undone in an app, but it echoed through the house like the shifting of an old beam, the kind you don't notice until the ceiling settles differently. She stared at the screen for a moment, confirming the cancellation. A green check mark appeared. Just like that, it was done. The morning sun slid gently across her desk, catching the edge of a silver-framed photo above her computer, Natalie, age 10, standing barefoot in a garden, her fingers stained with tomato vines. Sharon had snapped the photo during a summer project they called Grow Something Together. She hadn't grown much since. She leaned back in her chair, a small creak breaking the hush of the room. Her workspace was compact, efficient, the last room in the house she still truly used. The walls were pale cream, softened further by time and dust. A corkboard on one side held receipts, bank statements, and reminders that no longer felt urgent. Beneath it, her laptop hummed softly as she scrolled through her accounts. She paused at each line, verifying unlinking closing. Natalie's name appeared 4 times, 2 tuition transfers, 1 credit card backup, and an auto-donation to a wellness foundation Natalie had championed. One by one, Sharon removed her ties. It wasn't anger that guided her fingers. It was clarity, like cleaning out a drawer you didn't realize was full of things you no longer needed. The phone rang. She let it buzz twice before answering. "Hi, sweetheart." "Hey, Mom." Justin's voice was low, hesitant. "How are you doing?" Sharon smiled faintly. "Spring's early this year. The backyard's waking up." A pause. Justin exhaled. "Listen, I just wanted to ask if you were still thinking of coming to the wedding." Sharon's hand tightened slightly around the phone. "Your sister made her position clear." Another pause. "Yeah, she didn't mean it that way. She's just under a lot of pressure." "She said it clearly enough." Sharon replied, her tone calm. "I won't be there, Justin. I didn't mean to make this call awkward. It isn't awkward." She glanced at the window. The cherry blossoms had begun to scatter, drifting like pink confetti onto the lawn. "You're not responsible for what she wrote." Justin hesitated again. "I just want everyone to be okay." "I know," she said. "And you always try to keep things even. You're good at that." He didn't respond right away, and Sharon could almost picture him rubbing his forehead the way he did when he was caught between people. "Okay," he finally said. "Let me know if you need anything." "Really?" "I will." After the call, she sat still for a while, the phone resting face down on the desk, her tea cooling beside it. She picked up her phone again, opened the Livestream app Natalie's planner had suggested for long-distance guests. With 2 taps, she deleted it. "I don't need to watch what already told me I wasn't wanted," she murmured aloud, not for the room, but for herself. The house didn't echo, but something within her shifted, subtly but irrevocably. Later that evening, she climbed the stairs to the hall closet. Among dusty albums and old holiday cards, she pulled out the large navy blue photo book, leather-bound, fraying at the edges. She carried it to the living room, sat beneath the lamp's warm light, and opened to a random page. There she was, Natalie, maybe 4 years old, in a faded yellow dress, standing near the kitchen table. A teacup sat beside her porcelain with tiny blue flowers. The same pattern Sharon still used. But it wasn't the teacup that caught her eye. It was Natalie's face. She wasn't smiling. Her tiny shoulders were hunched just slightly. Her eyes weren't looking at the camera, but to the side at something or someone just out of frame. There was a sadness there, a small one, but unmistakable. In the old photo album, she found a picture of young Natalie standing beside a teacup with a face that looked quietly sad. Someone knocked on Sharon's door at 6 p.m. A stranger holding a handwritten letter from Robert. She hesitated before opening. The sky outside was dimming a soft rain, tapping against the porch railing. Through the yellow glow curtains, her living room was soaked in the kind of warm quiet only early evening brings when dinner's done. The world slows, and people retreat inward. The knock came again, gentle but certain. She cracked the door open. Mrs. Lorne, a young man, stood there mid-twenties, wearing a dark green jacket speckled with rain. "I have something for you. I was asked to hand it over personally." He extended an envelope cream-coloured thick, with her name written in pen. No stamp. No return address. Sharon took it without a word. The man tipped his cap, slightly turned, and walked down the steps into the mist. No further explanation. She shut the door and stood there for a moment, her thumb brushing the edge of the envelope. The handwriting was familiar, decades older, shakier now, but unmistakable. Robert. She walked to her reading chair by the window and sat down slowly. The rain outside had softened into a whisper. She turned the envelope over. It was unsealed. No tricks, no ceremony, just him. She slid out the letter, unfolded it carefully, and read, "Sharon, I heard what happened. Couldn't bring myself to call. Some things are better not said aloud. But I wanted you to know Florence in autumn is still beautiful. The city hasn't changed much. Maybe we have. But the river looks the same, and the bells still ring at 6. She paused. "If you ever do come this time, come fully. No half steps, no apologies. Just be. If this is the moment you finally leave, don't look back." She blinked once, then read it again and again. The letter was brief, but it carried the weight of years folded between its lines. Robert had always been like that, few words, but never wasted. She didn't cry. Instead, she stood crossed the room and reached for the old bookshelf beneath the stairs. It groaned softly as she opened the glass door. Her fingers skimmed past photo albums, gardening manuals, and cookbooks from another life. Then she found it an old travel guide. Florence and Tuscany, 1998 edition. Still worn at the edges, its spine cracked just enough to fall open to a familiar page. Inside was a folded map, neatly tucked between pages, about the Arno River. She hadn't touched it in years. She held the book in her lap and leaned back, the rain still murmuring against the windows. Robert hadn't needed to explain. She remembered Florence. The way they had walked the narrow streets, students again, for a brief second, tasting life too late and too fast. He had been kind, gentle, but always respectful of her distance. They had danced around something unspoken for years, until life moved on. It always did. But the letter, it was not a request. It was a reminder. Her eyes, so often tired these days, held a different light now, not of sorrow, but of thought. Not pain, but pause. As if something long dormant had stirred. She read the last line once more. "If this is the moment you finally leave, don't look back." The last line of the letter read, "If this is the moment you finally leave, don't look back." Sharon received the wedding postcard, but the address was wrong. The second line didn't have her name. It had arrived that afternoon, a little damp at the corners from the rain. She'd stopped by the local post office, tucked in between a bakery and a hardware store, both closed early for the drizzle. The place smelled faintly of paper and lemon-scented floor cleaner. A soft instrumental tune played from a speaker somewhere near the ceiling. The young clerk behind the counter smiled as she handed Sharon the envelope. "Looks like a wedding invite," she said cheerfully, her eyes flicking briefly to the return address before settling back on Sharon's face with a trace of something more cautious, something close to sympathy. Sharon nodded and stepped aside, not wanting to open it in front of anyone. She walked to the small overhang outside and stood beneath it, shielding the paper from the rain. It was a simple cream card, embossed letters, elegant font. "You are cordially invited." But on the envelope her name was missing, just the address. No Mrs. Sharon Lawn, not even Mom. Just numbers. Just a house. She blinked slowly, turning it over in her hands. The ink had smudged slightly from the moisture. Inside the card, Natalie's name was printed beside her fiancé's. The date, time, and venue were all there. It was formal, precise. Even a note about attire. But not once anywhere on the invite did her name appear. She read it twice. Then once more her lips pressed into a neutral line. Her phone buzzed. It was Justin. "Hey Mom, just checking, did the invite come through? Nat asked me to make sure." Sharon typed slowly. "Yes, just arrived." There was a pause. Then another message. How did it look? She stared at the screen for a long moment before calling him. "Hi, sweetheart." "Hey," he said, voice cautious. "Everything okay? I got the card?" "Good." She said the first batch had some printing issues, maybe the address. She forgot to include my name. There was silence. "I mean, the address is correct, but I'm not mentioned. Not on the envelope, not inside either." Justin exhaled. "Mum?" I don't think she meant it. "She's been really?" Sharon interrupted gently. "Do you think I should go? More silence?" "I don't know, Mum," he finally said. "I really don't." That was enough. Sharon ended the call kindly and stepped out into the rain card, tucked back into her coat. The drizzle had become finer, a cool mist that clung to her skin and made her fingers sting slightly. She walked the 2 blocks home without rushing. The sidewalk was slick, and the air smelled of wet bark and asphalt. Cars passed slowly. The sky hung low. As she turned onto her street, a neighbor waved from under a large blue umbrella. "Sharon, you're out in this? Where's your coat?" Sharon looked down at herself. She hadn't noticed she'd left it unzipped. "I just went to look for my name in a wedding card," she said, offering a thin smile. "Didn't find it." The neighbor blinked, confused. But Sharon didn't explain. She just kept walking. Back home, she hung her damp scarf, changed her shoes, and moved quietly through the house. The silence felt different today, not oppressive, but clear. She sat down at her desk, opened her laptop, and paused for a long moment. Then she typed into the search bar, "Flights from Newark to Florence." Flexible dates. Sharon returned home, opened her laptop, and began searching for flights to Florence. Natalie finally called back, only to say, "Don't make everything so uncomfortable, Mum." The call came late. Sharon was in the kitchen, the small lamp over the sink, casting a soft cone of yellow onto the countertop. Outside, the neighborhood was still save for the occasional hum of a car passing in the dark. The fridge buzzed an old rhythmic whir she'd long since stopped hearing until now. Her phone lit up on the table. Natalie. She hesitated before answering and turned on the speaker. Her hands were busy cradling a cup of chamomile, but her heart was already bracing. "Hi, Mom." Natalie began, her voice clipped too bright to be natural. Sharon said nothing for a moment. "Hello? I just wanted to clear the air before the big day." Natalie continued. "I know you got the card." "I did," Sharon replied evenly. There was a pause, a breath on Natalie's end. "I didn't mean to leave your name out." It was a mistake from the printer, she said hurriedly. And the email, I was just trying to keep things simple. Sharon let the silence sit. Natalie filled it. Look, I just want the wedding to go smoothly. That's all. You being there, it just makes people uncomfortable. Sharon placed the cup down slowly. Uncomfortable because of me, or because of what you haven't told them? Another pause. Natalie's voice tightened. I'm just asking you not to make a scene. I've never made a scene in my life, Sharon said softly. Then don't start now. Sharon leaned back in her chair, the cool of the wood seeping through her cardigan. You're punishing me for something, she said. But you haven't told me what. Natalie scoffed. I'm not punishing anyone. I want control over my own life, over my wedding. You have it. Then respect that. Sharon closed her eyes. This isn't about the wedding, Natalie. You stopped calling years ago. You started making plans without me years ago. There was silence again. And then Natalie said it, sharp, deliberate, and with a chill colder than any email. I don't need to love you to be a good person. The words landed like a door closing. Sharon didn't flinch, but inside something quiet cracked. She remembered a night long ago, Natalie at 12 bursting into the room with a drawing. A child's watercolour sunset, messy and bright, with stick figures holding hands. Look, Mum, I made this today. But Sharon had been on the phone discussing overtime shifts and patient records. She'd barely looked up. Put it on the table. I'll see it later. Natalie had stood there, small and hopeful, then smaller still, as she slunk away, picture still in hand. Sharon never did see that drawing again. Now, as her daughter spoke from hundreds of miles away, full of poise and distance, Sharon felt the weight of every moment left unattended. I see, Sharon said at last. Natalie said nothing more. They both stayed on the line for a few seconds longer. Then Sharon ended the call gently without a word. She walked into the living room. In the drawer beneath the old lamp, between letters and loose photographs, lay a folded piece of paper, creased, faded. It was the drawing. Somehow she had kept it. The sunset was still there, bright oranges and purples bleeding across the page. The stick figures still held hands. She looked at it for a long time. Then she folded it again, slowly, precisely, walked to the fireplace, opened the small iron grate, and fed it to the flame. Sharon hung up the phone, folded the old drawing Natalie once gave her, and burned it in the fireplace. The next morning, the medlar tree in Sharon's front yard, the one she'd long assumed was dead, sprouted its first pale white bud. She spotted it just as the light touched the rim of the roof, still in her nightgown watering can in hand. The soil was dry and uneven, cracked from weeks without care. Yet there it was, a single bloom, shy and defiant against the odds. She crouched slowly, knees stiff, and leaned closer. It wasn't much, just a tight spiral of petals not yet opened, but it was enough to stop her breath for a moment. The medlar had always been fickle. She had planted it years ago, shortly after her husband died, and it had bloomed then, as if in sympathy. But the last 3 springs had brought nothing. She had stopped expecting, stopped hoping. Yet here it was, proving her wrong in silence. She stood and walked back inside to fetch her gloves, then returned to the yard. The morning was cool, with a clarity only early spring could bring. She spent the next hour pruning back the dead branches, careful not to touch the new bud. Her gloves were worn, the stitching loose, but they still did the job. As she worked, her mind quieted. There was comfort in small tasks. Sharon, a voice called from the gate. She turned. It was Doris, her neighbour of 20 years, bundled in a pink windbreaker, a bag of groceries in one hand. I saw your light on, Thought I'd say hi before heading in. Sharon wiped her brow with the back of her glove. Morning. Doris looked toward the tree. Is that the old medlar blooming again? Seems like it. Sharon said, a faint smile crossing her face. Doris stepped closer, peering at the small white bud. Well, would you look at that? Maybe things aren't as finished as we think. There was a pause. So Doris said gently, the big wedding's coming up. You packing? Sharon pulled off one glove, tapping dirt from her fingers. I think they've packed without me. Doris frowned. Oh, Sharon. It's all right, Sharon said with a lightness that surprised even herself. I think I'm beginning to see that it's not just about one event. It's about 100 small ways someone can move you out of frame without you noticing. Doris said nothing, only nodded. Sharon's phone buzzed in her apron pocket, a message from Justin. I think you're right, Mum. But what are you planning to do? She stared at the words for a long time, then typed back, I'm going to live like they never pushed me aside. She didn't wait for a reply. Inside, she cleaned her hands, poured herself a small cup of tea, and sat by the kitchen table. The travel site was still open on her laptop from the night before. She scrolled past the usual suggestions, New York, Miami, San Diego, and typed slowly, Florence, Italy. Her fingers paused over the dates. The wedding was set for that weekend. She selected the same day. With a few clicks, it was done. She booked a flight to Florence on Natalie's wedding day. The routine health screening read, You are fit for extended travel. The words were typed in a standard font, no flourish, no warmth. But Sharon stared at them as if they'd been handwritten in gold ink. She folded the paper neatly, slid it back into the envelope, and tucked it into her handbag. Around her, the clinic hummed, with a low sterility, the buzz of fluorescent lights, the muffled cough of an elderly man in the next room, the distant sound of a printer struggling through a queue. The doctor, a tall man with kind but tired eyes, adjusted his glasses. Is this for something urgent? Sharon smiled faintly. Not urgent, just overdue. He glanced at her chart. You're in excellent shape for your age, Mrs. Talbot. Heart strong. Blood work clean. That's good, she said. I'm planning to leave the country. That made him pause. For long, she shrugged. As long as I need to remember who I was. The doctor hesitated, then said quietly, It's not everyone who has the courage to change at this stage in life. Sharon said nothing, but something behind her sternum fluttered like a curtain lifting to let air back in. That afternoon, she stood in front of the mirror holding her old passport. It still bore her husband's surname. The photo was 10 years old. She barely recognized the woman staring back, hair darker eyes more alert, the kind of face that still flinched when people raised their voices. She flipped it closed and slipped it into her drawer alongside a yellowed vaccination record. She'd need to update that. Justin came over around 5. He brought printer paper and a quiet demeanor, like he wasn't sure how to enter the space she now occupied. They sat in the kitchen. I can help book the appointment for your shots, he said. Sharon nodded. And I need help printing out the itinerary. Justin tapped on the keyboard, glancing sideways at her. You sure about this, Mum? No, she said plainly. But I'm going anyway. He smiled. While the printer worked, she stood up and walked into her study. It was time. The room had become dusty, with neglect papers from Natalie's grad school applications, still sat in a box under the desk, unopened for years. There was a manila folder marked Household, and she opened it now with the precision of a nurse prepping a tray. She pulled out a single document, a bank authorization form, one she'd signed years ago, giving Natalie co-access to a shared account. Quietly, Methodically, she logged in online, revoked the access, and cut up the spare debit card resting in her drawer. A small action. But it felt like clearing brush in a thick forest. Just one patch of space. Reclaimed. The sun dipped lower. Shadows moved across the desk. She went back to the kitchen, poured herself tea, and sat across from her son. "It's done," she said. Justin didn't ask what. He simply nodded. Just after 6, the doorbell rang. At first, Sharon thought it was Doris, or maybe a package from the pharmacy. But the envelope had no return name, only the fine print of a law firm's watermark. She stared at the corner logo before flipping it open. Inside was a letter, formal cold. "This document serves as a notice to request that you refrain from contacting Natalie Talbot or attending her upcoming private event. Legal action may be considered if boundaries are not respected." Her hands did not tremble. She folded the paper, once placed it face down on the table, and stared out the window. A courier envelope arrived sent by Natalie's lawyer. In the packet from the lawyer, one line stood out: "My mother is no longer an influence within this family." Sharon read the sentence twice. The font was Times New Roman. The language clinical, intentionally vague, like an apology scrubbed clean of guilt. But it wasn't an apology. It was a declaration, a signature under erasure. She sat straighter in her chair, the brass lamp on her desk casting a soft circle over a sea of paperwork. The desk hadn't been this cluttered since her husband passed a quiet pile of hospice instructions and funeral home brochures then. Now it was printouts and forms with her name misspelled or missing altogether. She adjusted her glasses and began reading from the top. Notice of family restructuring. Request to remove parental advisory rights. Statement of non-involvement for upcoming legal transactions. Natalie hadn't just barred her from a wedding. She'd tried to write her out of the entire narrative. Sharon reached for a pen and began underlining, not for emotional reasons, just to track inaccuracies. An hour later, the screen of her laptop blinked to life with an incoming video call. Robert's face appeared framed by bookshelves and afternoon Florentine light. "You look like hell," he said, without preamble. "Thanks," Sharon replied without smiling. "I assume you got something nasty in the mail." She lifted the packet into view. "Natalie hired a lawyer." Robert raised a brow. "To sue you for existing, more or less," Sharon said. He leaned back, exhaling. "Are you angry?" She paused, then shook her head. "No. I'm remembering the law." That made him laugh, a low, surprised chuckle. "Ah, the Sharon I remember." She ended the call, took a deep breath, and turned to her filing cabinet. It hadn't been opened in years. But everything was still alphabetized. Sharon had kept records of every joint account, every property co-signature, every minor clause her late husband had thought was too boring to review. It took 30 minutes. But eventually, she found what she was looking for. A title deed, signed by both her and her husband in 1994. The Talbot family home, not just the one she currently lived in, but also the summer house upstate, was still in both their names. No power of attorney, no legal amendment. Natalie hadn't noticed, or had assumed she had full rights after her father passed. Sharon sat down again. This time the pain in her chest had a shape. Not sorrow, something steadier. Control. She drafted an email. Simple. Precise. "Thank you for forwarding the revised clauses. I'd like to confirm a few of my own regarding shared property and legacy distribution." She didn't press send. Not yet. But she saved it to drafts, reread it once, and then once more. And then she closed her laptop with the calmness of someone who had just remembered they were still holding the pen. She wrote an email. "Thank you for sending the clauses. I have a few of my own I'd like to confirm. Sharon stood at JFK Airport, a round-trip ticket to Florence in hand. Her luggage carried nothing but books, medication, and a single teacup wrapped carefully. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, and the loudspeaker crackled with updates in multiple languages. Around her, family's rushed children tugged on straps, couples whispered itineraries. Sharon moved among them, slowly, calmly, out of sync, yet not out of place. She wore a navy blue coat she hadn't zipped. Her scarf was tied with deliberate care, her shoes recently polished. No one around her would have guessed that the woman with the slight limp had spent the last week uninviting herself from her own family. At the check-in counter, she handed over her passport and ticket without a word. The attendant smiled, typed swiftly, then handed her a boarding pass. "Have a wonderful trip, ma'am." Sharon offered a polite nod. "Thank you." Near the terminal gate, Justin waited. He didn't wave, just stood, hands in his jacket pockets, shoulders tight. "You didn't have to come," Sharon said. He shrugged. "I wanted to." They sat together on a row of orange chairs bolted to the floor. Silence stretched between them, not awkward, just long. Sharon glanced at him. His eyes were tired, older than she remembered. He looked like his father when he didn't sleep. "I never wanted it like this," he said quietly. "I know," Sharon replied. "You never chose sides." He opened the small paper envelope in his hand and slid a folded photo into hers. A moment captured from a different life, Natalie no more than 6 in a yellow sundress. Justin holding a toy plane, Sharon behind them laughing. She could tell from her eyes in the photo that she had been surprised by the camera. Sharon looked at it for a few seconds, then carefully placed it in her purse. "You'll text me when you land?" he asked. She nodded. He didn't hug her right away. When he did, it was brief. His arms firm and warm. She didn't cry. He didn't either. On the plane, she took the window seat and slid her carry-on beneath the seat in front of her. She opened it just long enough to check the contents. Books of coarse light fiction and 1 volume of poetry. Her prescriptions in a zippered pouch. And wrapped in 2 layers of cloth, the porcelain teacup with the blue flowers. She had brought it not for sentiment, but for ceremony. A woman in the aisle seat beside her smiled as she buckled in grey hair, sharp eyes, a scarf with tiny violins printed on it. First time flying, the woman asked, friendly, but not intrusive. Sharon looked at her, then out the window, where the early morning light was turning the edges of the runway golden. "No," she said softly. "But it's the first time I don't plan to come back." The woman paused, then nodded once, as if understanding something larger than words. As the plane accelerated down the tarmac, Sharon leaned back and closed her eyes. When she opened them again, they were in the air clouds drifting below like soft continents. She turned her head toward the light, and it touched the teacup's curved surface through the fabric, as if casting a glow through time itself. She looked out the plane window. The sunlight caught the edge of the carefully wrapped teacup, like light cutting through time. Sharon stood in front of the small rental house in Florence, its balcony draped in ivy and an old tea cabinet inside, as worn and quiet as she was. The stone walls of the building were sun-warmed, flaking slightly near the base, where vines had crept for decades. The shutters were painted green, but chipped at the edges, and when the breeze pushed through them, they creaked like they had something to say. She unlocked the front door with a brass key and stepped into the quiet. The house smelled of citrus and aged wood. A narrow hallway led to a small living space, a kitchen no larger than her old pantry, and a single bedroom with a balcony just wide enough for a chair and a table. She unpacked slowly. The books went on the windowsill, her medications into a ceramic bowl near the sink. And finally, from the center of her carry-on, she unwrapped the teacup blue flowers, still intact, porcelain still faintly cool. She placed it gently on the kitchen shelf beside a tin of Earl Grey she had brought with her. Then from her purse, she pulled out a photograph of her blooming sun tra tree and pinned it with a magnet to the refrigerator door. Outside, the bells from a nearby church tower rang noon. She didn't rush. That afternoon, a knock came at the door. She opened it to find Robert, taller than she remembered, a little thinner, but with the same eyes. He held a small bag in one hand and a loaf of bread in the other. "You found it," she said. "I did," he replied, "and I brought bread, because some things don't change." They didn't hug. It wasn't necessary. Instead, they walked, down narrow streets that opened onto sudden piazzas, past shops full of leather-bound journals and fresh pasta hanging like laundry. When they reached the Ponte Vecchio, Sharon paused. "Last time I was here, she said Natalie was still small enough to hold with one arm." Robert looked at her quietly. She fell once, Sharon continued, tripped on the stone steps in Siena, scraped her knee, cried like it was the end of the world. He waited. "And I didn't pick her up," she said. I told her, "You're fine. It's nothing." Robert tilted his head. "You were trying to make her strong." "I thought I was," Sharon murmured. But maybe what she needed wasn't strength. They reached a bench overlooking the river. Sharon sat watching the water ripple beneath the fading light. "I've been thinking," she said after a pause, "maybe I always thought love was something you did." I cleaned her room, paid her bills, stayed up all night when she had the flu. Robert didn't interrupt. "But Natalie?" Sharon sighed. She needed words. Maybe she needed me to say, "You're enough," or "You matter more than all the things I do for you." A long silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable. Robert finally spoke, his voice gentle. "If you could do it again, start over, what would you do differently?" Sharon looked out over the river, the sun now dipping low behind the dome of a distant basilica. "I'd rewrite the letter," she said quietly. "The one I never sent." Robert asked, "If you could do it again, what would you do differently?" "Sharon, I'd rewrite the letter from the first chapter." Natalie posted the wedding photos. Not a single line mentioned mother, but the tag still had Sharon's name like a shadow. The espresso cup trembled slightly in Sharon's fingers as she scrolled. Her phone was on low brightness, the sunlight over Florence's central piazza soft but steady. Bells chimed far away. The clinking of cups and murmur of Italian chatter around her didn't register. All her focus was on the screen. A white dress, a marble staircase, Natalie with her hand in her new husband's. The backdrop looked like a vineyard in Napa. Sharon blinked, not at the beauty of it, but at the emptiness. No caption about gratitude, no mention of a mother who raised her. But her name was there, tagged in the image buried beneath filters and floral emojis. Quiet, inert, an invisible thread, still connecting her to a story she was no longer allowed to speak in. "She tagged me," Sharon whispered. Robert, sitting across from her, looked up from his coffee. "What, she didn't mention me in the post, but she tagged me, like a placeholder or a ghost." She handed him the phone. He scrolled slowly, then stopped. One comment stood out. "Where's her mum? I thought she passed away." Sharon stared at the comment. Not angry, not hurt, just paused. She didn't reply, she didn't correct, she didn't even screenshot it. Instead, she opened her notes app and copied it down, word for word. "You're not going to say anything?" Robert asked gently. "No," she said, her voice steady. "They already said what they believe, and I know what's real." She turned off her phone and set it face down on the table. Later that evening, Sharon sat by the open balcony of her small Florence flat. The air smelled faintly of citrus. A church bell rang somewhere in the distance. She had a single lamp lit, and in front of her were the legal documents she'd carried from New Jersey. Her fingers moved slowly over the pages. There it was, the inheritance clause her husband had left untouched. Assets co-owned, properties, investments, insurance, all of it still bearing Sharon's name. Robert, now seated across the room, with a newspaper folded over his knee, glanced at her. "You're still reading?" "Yes." "Looking for a fight?" "No," she said quietly. "Looking for clarity?" He leaned back, considering. "You know," he said after a moment, "maybe you don't need anyone to call you mother to be one." She met his gaze. "Maybe you don't need recognition," he continued. "Maybe you just need to know you were right." That landed softly. Not like consolation, like truth. She turned back to the documents. Then slowly, carefully, Sharon reached for a pen. There was one clause Natalie had always assumed would transfer to her. A real estate holding in Vermont, the summer cabin where they once spent holidays, Sharon, her husband, and two small bickering children. It was still legally Sharon's. With one stroke, she marked the section and began filling in a different beneficiary. Sharon reopened the financial documents and began preparing to transfer the asset Natalie had once tried to claim to someone else. The will Sharon had written in 2012, the one Natalie had quietly tucked away, was unexpectedly returned by the notary. The envelope was thick, the kind that made a distinct sliding sound when you opened it. Sharon held it for a moment longer before breaking the seal, the Florence rain tapping gently on the window behind her. She spread the documents on the kitchen table, her glasses low on her nose, a pencil in hand. Her cup of tea sat untouched steam, curling into the dim morning air. There it was, her handwriting from 13 years ago. She remembered the day she signed it. It was raining then, too. Her husband had passed just a year earlier, and Natalie had insisted they get everything in order. Natalie had even taken the signed copy, saying she'd keep it safe. Sharon's lips tightened as she scanned the lines. She flipped through the newer document, the one Natalie's lawyer had sent a few weeks ago. It was neat, impersonal, worded with clinical detachment. She compared clause for clause, date for date. And then she saw it. A missing line. In the original 2012 will, any change to this distribution must be co-signed by the grantor or the agreement shall remain as initially witnessed. Gone. In Natalie's version, that clause was absent. The section marked Dependent Asset Authority scrubbed out. Not challenged, erased. Sharon didn't blink. Instead, she pulled the two documents side by side and began highlighting the differences. Robert arrived shortly after lunch, carrying figs and a bag of roasted almonds. "You look like a woman ready to overturn Parliament," he joked. "I've just discovered," Sharon said, not looking up, "that my daughter tried to erase my signature. Not metaphorically. Legally." Robert's smile faded. "She altered the will," no, Sharon corrected. "She buried it. Sent a partial copy instead of the real one." He sat beside her. "Do you want to fight her?" "I know someone who knows," Sharon interrupted gently. "I don't want to fight her." Robert looked confused. "Then what? I want to rewrite it." She turned to a blank form beside her, already downloaded and pre-filled with some of her information. "I want it clear," she said. "No hidden lines, no assumptions. No room for someone to tell me later what I meant." Rain softened against the glass behind them. Sharon wrote slowly, deliberately. When she reached the section for beneficiaries, she paused. She didn't hesitate when she removed Natalie's name. Instead, she wrote one sentence beneath the deletion: "The named party has by repeated action and declaration relinquished both obligation and claim to this estate. She sat back, exhaled. It's not out of spite, she said to no one in particular. It's out of clarity. Robert nodded, though he said nothing. She sent the new will by email to her old attorney with the subject line, "For clarity." Robert invited Sharon over for dinner. On the table sat a bowl of pumpkin soup and an empty chair for the one not yet forgiven. The apartment smelled faintly of thyme and roasted squash. A single candle flickered on the table, casting gold along the chipped edges of ceramic bowls. Robert's place in Florence was modest, but full of memory, faded paintings, well-worn books, and a sense that nothing here was rushed. Sharon stepped inside, setting her scarf on the back of the nearest chair. "Is the chair for me?" she asked, with a half-smile, pointing to the empty one beside him. Robert chuckled. "No, that one's always there. For the person who hasn't asked to be forgiven yet." She didn't reply right away. Her eyes drifted to the bowl of pumpkin soup steam, curling upward, like the breath of something gentle. They sat. For a few moments, only the sound of spoons against bowls, soft and slow. "It's good," Sharon said eventually. "It's honest," Robert replied. "Grew the squash myself. Burnt the first batch." Sharon looked down at her bowl. "I did worse than burn dinner once." Robert raised an eyebrow. "I slapped her," Sharon said. "Natalie. Once when she was 16. He didn't speak. She came home late." Sharon continued. Didn't answer her phone. "I wasn't angry because of what she did. I was angry because I was scared, and I had no one to take it out on. So I lashed out at the only person I loved most." Robert didn't offer comfort. He didn't say you were under pressure or we all make mistakes. Instead, he refilled her bowl quietly. "I never apologized," Sharon added, "and she never brought it up. But I think that moment stayed. Silence again." The candle leaned wax, pooling in a saucer. The third chair, the one not yet forgiven, sat still and empty. Later, with soup bowls pushed aside and only mugs left on the table, Sharon exhaled. "I wasn't a perfect mother. Maybe not even a good one sometimes. But I showed up. I stayed. I worried. I protected. And even if I failed, I was still her mother." Robert nodded. "That's not something anyone gets to erase," she said. Robert asked, "So what do you want now?" "Sharon, a cup of tea, and nothing more." Sharon sent a parcel to Natalie's house, no return address. Inside, a scanned copy of the new will and a photo of the blooming hawthorn tree. The post office in Florence was warm with late morning light, though the queue of people waiting carried a patience only found in old cities. Sharon stood at the end, her hands wrapped around the small parcel like it was something living. Outside the arched glass doors, leaves tumbled from tired trees, soft golds and rust-coloured reds. The parcel was neatly wrapped in brown paper tied with twine. The address on the label was printed cleanly, Natalie's old home in New Jersey. No name followed it. Sharon had been deliberate. When it was finally her turn, the young postal clerk smiled as he reached for the box. "Return address?" he asked, holding out a sticker. Sharon shook her head. "No need," she said gently. He paused. "Are you sure, in case it doesn't get delivered?" Sharon gave him a small smile. "If they need to know who sent it, they'll know." The clerk nodded and took the box away. She stepped out into the light. The air had cooled the kind that clung to the edges of your sleeves. Sharon paused on the steps outside the post office, then walked slowly across the square. Pigeons fluttered near a fountain, and somewhere beyond the terracotta roofs, a church bell chimed the hour. She didn't rush. No one watched her. Yet she felt for the first time in years completely visible. not as someone's mother, not as someone omitted, but as herself. Later that evening, thousands of miles away in New Jersey, the mail carrier dropped a small, unfamiliar parcel into a tidy metal mailbox. Natalie opened the door with a grocery bag tucked in her elbow. She bent to retrieve the package, her brows knitting at the absence of a sender. Inside, wrapped in tissue, was a photo of a blooming hawthorn tree, its white petals soft and triumphant against a worn wooden fence. Beneath it, a scan of a new will. Natalie's hands trembled slightly. She looked at the photo again. The tree, once a brittle skeleton she used to walk past without noticing, was now alive with defiance and grace. Scene cuts to America. Natalie receives the parcel. Her eyes waver as she looks at the photo of the blooming hawthorn tree. Sharon sat in a corner of the local market, teaching a little Italian girl to write her name in English. Your name is Rosa, like the flower. The market in Florence was alive with colour and motion, the kind that woke your senses in ways no alarm ever could. Baskets of tomatoes, glossy and red, sat beside loaves of warm bread wrapped in brown paper. The scent of rosemary and sage wafted from a stall at the far end, where a woman with silver hair called out greetings to regulars. Sharon occupied a quiet bench near the herb stall. A well-worn notebook rested on her lap, its pages filled with looping cursive. Next to her sat Rosa, a small girl with dark curls and curious eyes gripping a pencil too tightly. Oh, A, Sharon said slowly, guiding the girl's hand. The pencil wobbled on the page, but the letters formed uneven stubborn, full of effort. Rosa looked up. That's me? Sharon smiled. Yes, your name is Rosa, like the flower. The girl giggled, tracing the loops again. Rosa's grandmother, who ran the herb stall, gave Sharon a nod of thanks from behind her table. They had never exchanged more than a handful of words, but their understanding ran deeper than language. Every Saturday, Rosa ran to Sharon. And Sharon, who once measured her worth by the invitations she didn't receive, now measured it in small hands and earnest letters. Rosa tilted her head. Do you have grandkids too? Sharon paused. She looked down at the page where Rosa had drawn a crooked rose in the corner. Then she smiled again. I know a few children who've taught me a lot. A man with a camera slung across his chest passed by and paused. Without asking, he took a photo, a woman and a child, sunlight, falling across their hands. He uploaded it that evening with a caption in Italian, La donna che insegna l'amore con il silenzio. The woman who teaches love through silence. It didn't go viral, but it went far enough. Thousands of miles away in a quiet New Jersey kitchen, Natalie scrolled through her feed. A photo caught her eye. She stopped, looked again. A bench, a market, a little girl writing in a notebook. And next to her, Natalie's thumb hovered above the screen. No name, no tags, no caption about who the woman was, just a single line. The woman who teaches love through silence. In the early morning, Sharon brewed the final pouch of tea she'd brought from America. The scent wasn't what it used to be, but she drank it slowly all the same. The sun filtered through the gauzy curtains of the small Florence balcony, casting long, soft shadows onto the stone floor. Outside, sparrows danced between terracotta pots, chirping as if to mark the beginning of something, or perhaps the gentle continuation of everything. Sharon moved without urgency. She watered the small potted herbs she had rescued from the corner grocer's discard pile. Her hands, once accustomed to measuring heartbeats and holding trembling limbs, now pressed against ceramic and soil with familiar care. She placed the teapot chipped along one edge onto the old iron table she had come to love. The tea was warm, slightly dull in flavour, but she didn't grimace. It was not the bitterness of loss anymore, but the plainness of presence. She sipped. A voice crackled from the small radio near the kitchen window. Italian headlines, something about a local election, drifted through the air like distant bird song. Sharon didn't listen for meaning. It was simply a part of the morning now, as natural as the light or the clink of her teaspoon. She opened her laptop not for anything urgent, just to read the daily digest of life she no longer had to be part of. Her inbox was mostly newsletters, quiet reminders of a life left behind. Except one. From Natalie Whitaker, subject, "None text me, Q Kong." "Are you well, Mum?" No greeting. No sign-off, just 7 small words. Sharon didn't flinch. She didn't race to reply. Instead, she closed the laptop slowly, her fingers brushing the lid like one might close a book that wasn't quite finished, but no longer hurt to read. She refilled her cup, her movements patient. Then, almost to herself, she murmured, "I'm well, just not the mother you remember." Her voice was steady, not bitter, not broken, just real. After a while, she opened the laptop again. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She typed, "Still," then paused. She read the word once, twice. There was no need to say more. No apology, no plea, no anger. Just a presence, a breath. A woman still here. She pressed send. Natalie had come to Florence unannounced, and now sat at a small cafe across from where Sharon taught Rosa, watching from a distance. The sunlight stretched long across the cobbled square, coating the stone in gold. Late afternoon in Florence had a way of quieting things, softening edges and slowing footsteps. Natalie sipped her espresso without tasting it, her fingers wrapped tightly around the small porcelain cup. She watched. Across the square, Sharon was crouched beside a small table, guiding Rosa's hand as the child traced letters. A chalkboard leaned against the wall with simple English words, scrawled on it, "Flower Light Home." Sharon's movements were unhurried, deliberate nothing like the tense woman Natalie remembered, who had always been 5 steps ahead of everyone, always calculating, always in control. This version of her mother wore loose linen, let the wind tousle her greying hair, and laughed when Rosa dropped her pencil. Natalie blinked slowly. Something stung behind her eyes, but didn't fall. When the lesson ended, and Rosa ran off to join her grandmother, Sharon sat alone for a moment, cleaning the pencils with a cloth. She looked peaceful, content. Natalie rose. She crossed the square each step, feeling both too light and impossibly heavy. Her heart thudded not with anger or even guilt, but with something she couldn't yet name. She placed a cup of coffee gently on Sharon's table. Sharon didn't flinch. Her eyes moved to the cup, then slowly up to her daughter. "I knew you'd come," she said quietly. Natalie sat without invitation. For a moment, the world around them continued tourists with maps, pigeons at their feet, the sound of a fountain somewhere behind them. "I didn't know." Natalie's voice cracked slightly. "I didn't know you were still alive like this." Sharon didn't respond. She stirred her tea, then placed the spoon down. "What do you want?" she asked, not coldly, but with the plainness of someone who had already grieved. Natalie looked down at her hands. The silence stretched, but didn't snap. Finally, she said, "I just wanted to understand why you never called me back." Sharon looked at her. Her expression was unreadable, not angry, not wounded, simply still. The coffee sat untouched between them. Night in Florence. Natalie stood outside Sharon's apartment holding an old photograph, Natalie at age 10, her face streaked with mud, and Sharon leaning down, wiping her cheek with the corner of her sweater. The hallway outside the apartment smelled faintly of stone and lavender. Natalie hesitated before knocking her fingers clenched around the worn photo, now smoothed by years of forgetting. Inside, Sharon lit the stove. The kettle began to hum softly, its quiet whistle rising like breath before speech. The small living room was filled with amber light. Robert sat at the far end of the table, flipping a book shut. When he saw Sharon's expression shift toward the door, he stood nodded once and disappeared silently into the adjacent room. Sharon opened the door. Natalie stood there, coat unzipped, wind tousling her hair, the photograph now damp with her palm's warmth. She said nothing. Sharon stepped aside. They sat in the dim-lit kitchen without words. The steam from the tea curled between them, a slow dance of warmth in the still air. Sharon poured 2 cups. She didn't ask why Natalie had come. Natalie placed the photo on the table. The image lay there, still vivid. A younger Sharon kneeling in a schoolyard, dabbing at a muddy-faced little girl with a calm that didn't match the chaos around her. Natalie stared at it, then spoke barely louder than the kettle's soft hiss. "I remember this moment," she said. "Because you didn't yell. You just wiped my face and asked if it hurt." Sharon looked at the image, then up at her daughter. "I thought you forgot," she said. Natalie didn't cry. Her voice shook, but she didn't reach for the tissue on the table. "There are things," she whispered, "that you never have to remind me of because they stuck. They're still on me even now." The photo trembled slightly as a draft slipped through the cracked window. Sharon didn't speak. She reached toward the teacup closest to her, then gently nudged it across the table toward Natalie. "Drink while it's hot," she said. Natalie looked down at the cup, the steam rising in gentle swirls. Her fingers didn't move right away, but her breathing slowed. They sat that way. 2 women. Not healed, not shattered. Just there. Still. "I was invited to speak at a panel," Natalie said, stirring her espresso. "They're calling it Women Who Inspire Across Generations. I'm going to talk about you." The bookstore was small and quiet, tucked between narrow alleys and a row of shuttered flower stands. Afternoon light filtered through the dusty window panes, falling softly on the rows of faded covers. A black cat curled beside the till. Behind the counter, the French shopkeeper nodded in Sharon's direction, then disappeared into the back room. Natalie reached into her bag and slid a folded sheaf of papers across the wooden table. "It's the draft," she said, "of my speech." Sharon looked at it but didn't reach. Instead, she folded the paper in half again and tucked it neatly into the inside pocket of her coat. "I'll read it later," she said. "When I'm home?" They didn't sit long. Natalie stood smoothing her coat. Sharon followed, and the 2 stepped outside together, the bell above the door chiming faintly behind them. The lake was only a 10-minute walk away. They wandered its perimeter slowly, not speaking much. The water was calm. A few ducks passed near the reeds. Natalie walked on Sharon's right, always a step behind, then beside, then behind again. She never took her mother's arm. But neither did she drift away. They paused at a bench overlooking the water. "I'm not going to use your name," Natalie said finally. "Not in the speech. I'll just describe you." Sharon nodded. "You don't need to." Natalie turned toward her, uncertain. Sharon didn't look at her. Her eyes stayed on the water, on the slow ripple of wind and reflection. "You know," Sharon said gently, "I don't need to be mentioned on a stage. I only need not to be erased from your memory." The wind picked up. A few leaves scattered across the path. Natalie took a breath, about to say something, then stopped. After a moment, she asked softly, "Do you still think about me?" Sharon didn't answer. Instead, she looked upward and pointed toward a branch overhead. A single white camellia flower drifted down its petals, trembling in the air, landing softly on the gravel. Her smile was small, but certain. The next month, a thin book arrived from the US unmarked simple wrapped in brown paper. On the first page, in clean serif type, it read, "To my mother, who taught me how to love without ever needing to speak." The morning was quiet. Sunlight slipped through the white kitchen curtain, cutting soft shapes onto the wooden floor. Sharon sat at the small kitchen table, a pale blue teacup beside her. Empty. She hadn't poured a second round. The pot had long gone cold, but she didn't mind. The book lay open in her lap. She turned the pages slowly as though each one held breath. The writing was tender, restrained like the sender. There were no grand acknowledgements, no soaring confessions. But in the details she saw herself. A line about holding a scraped knee and humming a song no one else knew. A paragraph about how some love is not seen, only carried. A passage describing the way a pair of hands folded laundry as if smoothing out grief itself. At some point she stopped reading. Not because she'd finished, but because the story had already returned to her unspoken, uninvited, like a scent that brings back a room you haven't entered in years. She closed the book, gently ran her hand along the cover, then placed it on the highest shelf of the narrow cabinet beside the stove. Not hidden, just waiting. Outside, the wind shifted slightly. She stepped onto the patio fingers, brushing against the ceramic railing as she passed. The potted camellia stood in the corner, trimmed healthy and somehow blooming. A single white flower out of season. Sharon smiled. No surprise. No awe. Just recognition. She reached out and let her fingers rest against the petals, soft, translucent, like memory when it's no longer sharp. Then she sat. The old wooden chair creaked beneath her, but she didn't move to fix it. She let the sounds happen. The birdsong from across the courtyard. The clink of a spoon from a neighbour's window. The faraway bell tower chiming once mid-morning. She didn't think of Natalie. She didn't think of the wedding, or the emails, or the words that had cut her so precisely. She didn't think of what she had lost. Instead, she sat with what remained. The air, the sun, the chair beneath her. The stillness that wasn't emptiness, but fullness, without needing to speak. Then as she reached for her book again, a small card fluttered out from between the pages, white folded. On the front, her name Mom in Natalie's handwriting. Inside, just one line, "Next time come." No need for a live stream. In the end, she didn't reclaim her place with a bang, nor did she beg for it. The silence they gave her became her stage, and from there, she rewrote the script, without shouting, without pleading, just by staying present. Justice may arrive late, but it resonates like the final chord of a long-forgotten melody. What was stolen wasn't her role as a mother, but the respect owed to a life quietly endured and firmly remembered. Sometimes all it takes is a woman who no longer waits to be invited. If this story stirred something in you, made you think of your own mother, or a silence you've carried, leave a comment below. We'd love to hear what part stayed with you the most. And if you believe stories like this deserve a voice, subscribe to Heavy Stories so you never miss a chapter of quiet strength and long overdue justice. Sometimes it's in the quietest moments that the loudest truths are heard.